Thanks for tuning in to another Ask A Prof live stream this Friday. So my name's Elena. I'm a coordinator with the Active Minds program, and I'll be your host today. So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Lheidli-T'enneh. So we would like to thank them for allowing us to work, learn, and play on their territories today. We'd also like to say a huge thank you to our mastermind presenting sponsor, BC Oil and Gas Commission, as well as our other fantastic sponsors, Radloff, Triton, New Gold, RVC, and Michael Reed Law Corporation. So today's guest joining us is going to be Dr. Chris Johnson. So Dr. Johnson is an applied biologist at UNBC, and he's going to be talking to us about species in Canada, so rare species, threatened species, and also some of the things that we can do to help out those species and just be kind to the environment around us, basically. So we'll finish off our live stream today with a Q&A. So if you have any questions, submit them in the comment section below, and we'll make sure they get answered for you at the end. That's all I have for you though, so I will let Dr. Johnson take it away. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Elena, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my virtual laboratory. As Elena said, my name is Chris Johnson. I'm a professor here at the University of Northern British Columbia, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about, talking about, teaching about, and researching wildlife. And that includes species like moose, river otters, lynx, and wolves. And I'm going to introduce you to my favorite species, a species I've been working on for about 20 years now. Well, here's a good friend of mine, and I'm wondering if anyone out there knows what species this is. I'll turn it off to the side a little bit. There you go. And here's a hint. This species is found on the Canadian quarter. All right, so hopefully you know who this is. It's an iconic species. It is caribou, and in this case, this is woodland caribou, and they're found close to Prince George. Now, the species that I work on are mainly animals. And animals are part of this big group of life on the planet Earth called biodiversity. And that's really the conjunction of two words, biological and diversity, biodiversity. And biodiversity includes the animals, of course, the plants, the fungi, and the bacteria. And biodiversity is really important for lots of different reasons. So today I'm going to ask you lots of questions. All right, I wish you were sitting here and we had a full sort of active audience, but hopefully you'll be able to participate from home or wherever you're watching this broadcast. So again, be ready. I'm going to ask you lots of different questions. So biodiversity, it's all the life around us. Why is that important? What is the big deal about biodiversity? Well, biodiversity is incredibly important, not just for us, but obviously the functioning of the planet. And if you think about your breakfast this morning, for example, maybe you had toast with jam and with butter. Biodiversity provided those products. You had grain in your bread, you had a milk product that created your butter, and of course you probably had a really yummy strawberry jam that came from strawberries, which is actually a plant, and at one time it was a wild plant. So biodiversity provides the things we eat and things to build houses. And biodiversity is also important because many of us just want to know that the species around us still exist. So even if they don't have any really practical value to people, many of us are still concerned that they persist on this planet or that humans don't play some role in the eventual extinction or loss of those species. So when we're talking about the loss of a species, we're talking about this process called extinction. And it can happen in lots of different ways. It can happen in different places around us. So for example, we could lose species from British Columbia. The actual technical term there would be extirpation, but it's local extinction. They're lost from BC. We could lose species from Canada. And again, that would be, for many people, something that we don't want to witness. And of course, we could lose species from the planet Earth. And once they're gone from the Earth, barring really sort of far-reaching technologies like cloning, that species is probably gone, at least for our lifetimes. So extinction is a really big deal. Now in British Columbia, we have about 1,400 species that are formally recognized as at risk of extinction. So they are somewhere along this plane of potentially disappearing. And that may be because the populations are declining, sometimes slowly, sometimes steeply, or it may just be a really rare species. So again, there's about 1,400 species in BC that we're worried about as biologists, as ecologists, in conserving them and keeping them around for the people of BC, but also the people of the world. So I just talked about this massive group of species, 1,400 different species that are potentially at risk of extinction. I'm wondering if you can think of any species that might be in that category. And again, don't just focus on the animals, think a little bit about the plants, think a little bit about the fungi. Heck, maybe you even got your favorite species of bacteria that you want to talk about. Anyway, let's think a little bit about those 1,400 species. I'm sure you can think of some. One of my favorites is, of course, that woodland caribou, a species I spent a lot of time studying, and a species that is extinct in many places. Sorry, not extinct, endangered in many places in Canada, including British Columbia. Now, I brought along a couple of other species, and we're going to have a little bit of a biodiversity quiz here, so please play along at home. You can keep your score, that would be great. There's no winners or losers. Some of these species are a little bit tricky to identify, some are easy, some are a little more difficult. So as I bring these species up, I want you to hopefully be able to identify them, and then try to think and determine if you know of the species being endangered in British Columbia or Canada. So you get a point for listing the species, and you get a point if you're correct in saying whether it's endangered or at risk of endangerment or extinction in BC or Canada. Okay, so my first species, I'm not much of a plant guy, but I had to bring a plant for all of my colleagues that study plants. Here we go. All right, now unfortunately this is brown. Normally those needles would be green, and it's from a tree that has a cluster of 5 needles. All right, and you can see a relatively large cone there. So if you guess it's a pine tree, that's really good. It's a whitebark pine, and it is endangered in Canada. And it's only found in Canada, in British Columbia and Alberta, at high elevations, so in the Rocky Mountains and in the coastal mountains in British Columbia. It's also found in the United States. Now, I raided my kids' bedrooms, and I brought a couple of other examples here. I'm just going to go into my bag of favorite species. Here's an easy one. All right, anyone recognize this guy? Let me give you a hint. It's a bear. It's a white bear. It's a polar bear. And no, we don't have polar bears in British Columbia. We do have them in Arctic Canada, and this is a species of special concern. So there is concern that one day it could become endangered or possibly even extinct in Canada. Okay, who else do we have here? Oh, I like this guy. Anyone recognize this one? All right, it's a penguin. And no, we don't have penguins in British Columbia. We don't have penguins in the northern hemisphere. We have them in the southern hemisphere unless you go to a zoo. This is called the little penguin, the little blue penguin. It's also known as the fairy penguin. It's the smallest penguin species, usually about 35 centimeters, maybe a little bit bigger. So a little bit bigger than this, but not much. And this species is of concern in New Zealand. It's also found in Australia, and it's also found in some parts of southern South America. Okay, so let's switch it up a little bit here. How about this one? Anyone recognize this species? So this is for all my entomology friends and colleagues. This is, yes, a monarch butterfly. And it is found in Canada, all right? Not in Prince George, not in northern Canada, but in southern Canada. And the monarch's claim to fame is that it has this massive migration, somewhat in the neighborhood of 5,000 kilometers, all the way down to winter in forests in Southern California and Mexico. And it is an endangered species in Canada, although it lives in 3 different countries. So it makes a really good point. We can do great things for the monarch in Canada, but we also need to have great things for the monarch in Mexico and the United States. Here's one. Anyone recognize this guy? All right, this is a bit of a trick question, of course. This is an unknown Asaurus. I don't know what type of dinosaur this is, but a great example of extinction, and in this case, mass extinction. So most of the dinosaurs disappeared about 65 million years ago, but they disappeared from largely natural processes. Anyone recognize this? All right, this is a deer, and this is a young deer, a fawn. Fortunately, this species is not endangered in Canada or British Columbia. Different deer species are quite common throughout British Columbia. I'm sure you've seen them on the side of the road, in farmers' fields, maybe even in your backyard. Anyone recognize this weird looking thing? What is it? This is a kiwi. It's a flightless bird. All right, there are a number of different kiwi species, all found in New Zealand, an island nation. All of those species are endangered. Some of them are highly or critically endangered. This species has had lots of problems, okay, with introduced species. So cats and stoats and other mammals have been introduced to New Zealand and has resulted in a drastic reduction in this bird, which is sort of the flagship bird for the country of New Zealand. Finally, let's end on an easy one. All right, I want everyone to get full points for this. Recognize this guy? All right, this is the mascot for endangered species in the world. This is, of course, the giant panda, okay, sometimes known as the panda bear, found in sort of central southern China. That's the only place you'll find the giant panda unless you go to a zoo. Until recently, we had giant pandas in the Calgary Zoo and the Toronto Zoo. I think they've been returned to China now because we couldn't provide enough bamboo. And these interesting bears eat close to 90 pounds of fresh bamboo shoots a day. About 99% of their diet is bamboo, purely vegetarian bear. All right, so again, a really interesting species, very cute and cuddly, has lots of challenges though in sort of maintaining its habitat in some of those places where it's found in China. Okay, so hopefully you scored all right on that. Okay, so we've got these endangered species in Canada. A great question is, what can we do to maintain those species? Well, we need to understand what the problems are, okay, why we're losing them. And there's lots of reasons why a species may become endangered. One of the big ones is habitat loss, okay? That may apply to a species like the giant panda. So we need to save habitat, we need to conserve, or in some cases restore habitat. There's lots of other reasons. In some cases it's over-exploitation, taking too many of these species out of the wild for things like food, the pet trade, taking sort of rare and exotic fish and reptiles and birds and selling them to people. Another big issue we talk a lot about is climate change. And what is that going to mean for species that are at risk of extinction? And there's lots of reasons to talk about climate change, lots of other reasons, of course, other than just endangered species. So what can we do to keep these species in Canada? Well, we can start talking about things like habitat conservation, managing the take of some species, thinking about controlling invasive species, and doing what we can relative to climate change. One of the other things we do for invasive species, for endangered species, and something that I'm involved in a lot with my work, is research. And so in developing protections or ways in which we can keep these species in Canada, we need to understand their ecology better. And one of the things we do as ecologists is we want to understand where these species live and what are their important habitats. And to do that, we oftentimes use different types of technology to actually record their locations as they move around across these landscapes that they occupy. So here's one tool that we use. This is called a GPS collar, okay? This came off a caribou, and we would put this on a caribou, we put it around its neck, and it has a GPS device, which is a computer that records signals from satellites, which are in orbit around the Earth, and then it calculates the location of that caribou based on those satellite signals, and then we can get that data out of here, put it into a computer, and then map it. Now you can see this collar's a little bit ripped up, all right? You can maybe even see some tooth marks. Turns out that wolves also really like GPS collars, okay? They're just like your dogs. Your dog chews on your shoe. A wolf, if it can get hold of a caribou or a GPS collar, it's going to play with this thing all day long. So this would be on a caribou. We put these on wolves, we put them on elk, we put them on deer. You can put these on elephants. Now at the other end of the sort of size spectrum for studying where animals go and why, I have a little tiny tag here, right? So this is the antenna, and right here, this little black button is the transmitter, and then there's just this little tiny collar here, which is actually elastic material with little tiny glass beads. And you just stretch it out, and you put it around the waist of a tailed frog. So a tailed frog is another species that we're somewhat concerned about. You can find these if you lived in northwestern British Columbia or Washington or California, and it's a species that we've put these little tags on, and we go out and we follow them through the forest, and we understand what types of habitats that these tailed frogs like. So that is everything that I have for you this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion about species at risk in Canada, about biological diversity, about why we need to maintain that biological diversity, and some of the things that we can do to help species at risk like we talked about today. And I hope you all did really well on the quiz. Thank you very much, and I would be glad to answer any questions.
All right, so we will start with our Q&A period now. So our first question was submitted by Orion, who is a club member of ours. So he wants to know, how come the only mammal that lays eggs is the platypus, and what is so special about it?
Oh, the platypus. Okay, I don't know a lot about marsupials because they live way on the other side of the world, all right? So we find these marsupials like platypus in Australia. And there are a number of species like platypus that lay eggs, and in the past there were probably a lot more. So what the platypus is kind of this evolutionary relic. Right? At one time we sort of had this evolution of mammals, and some of them laid eggs. Many of them went extinct, like the dinosaur. Some of them managed to stick around in these sort of island areas, and ultimately Australia is a big island, which has had a very different evolution of mammals than we'd find in North America. So the platypus is a super special species. It's this evolutionary relic. And again, it has this really, really interesting biology. So thanks for that question.
Awesome. Next question, also from Orion. He would like to know, in your opinion, what are the 3 most endangered species in Canada right now?
Oh boy, there are lots of endangered species in Canada. It's hard to pick sort of 3 that I think are the most endangered. One species that I hear sometimes people talk about, and they say this is the most endangered mammal in Canada, is the Vancouver Island marmot. All right, so we've got lots of marmots in Canada, well, not lots, but there's a number of different species of marmot. There's one species, the Vancouver Island marmot, it's only found there, and there are relatively few individuals left. And so that is one very endangered species. In some cases, my favorite species, the woodland caribou, in some places that is a very endangered species, so that's one that's very dear to my heart. And then there's other species like we talked about with the whitebark pine, which has lots of challenges. So it's still found in many places in British Columbia and Alberta, but there are concerns about how fire is changing, how climate change is changing, and it has this really nasty pathogen called whitebark pine blister rust that will kill the tree. So I don't know if those are the 3 most endangered, but those are 3 endangered species that a lot of people are talking about and studying at this time.
Very interesting. Next up here we have a question from Anson. They would like to know, have you ever seen an orca, and do you know how much they weigh?
Wow, I've been really lucky to see killer whales or orca on a number of different occasions. I grew up on Vancouver Island, southern Vancouver Island, so I remember as a little kid going out and fishing with my dad, and of course we would see lots of different things, but one of the species that always caught my attention was killer whales, incredibly majestic. I've had chances to see killer whales since then as part of boat tours, and again, a species that captures the attention of British Columbians, but also people sort of globally. They're a pretty large whale, not the largest whale, but there's somewhere in the neighborhood probably of around 1,500 kilograms for a small female to probably somewhere in the neighborhood of around 5,000 to 5,500 kilograms for a large male killer whale. I'm just guesstimating there. I'm not a whale biologist, I'm not a whale expert, but that's sort of roughly the range of size of that type of whale.
Very large animals for sure. Next up here, we have a question submitted on our social media. So, what can we do to prevent the decline of species?
What can we do to prevent the decline of species? Boy, that's the million-dollar question. And it really depends on the species that we're interested in. There are some species that have a very, very limited range. There are these little freshwater mussels, for example. They'll be found in these sort of upwellings in certain places, and maybe we can just set those little habitats aside. Same with some plant species that are only found in a few locations, very special locations, and maybe we need to set aside those little pieces of habitat as sort of a preserve. In other cases, we have species that range over very large areas like polar bear, and it's much more complicated, especially when we think about things like climate change and how climate change is happening now, but we also know it's going to happen progressively and affect bears greatly over the next 100 years. So how can we minimize our climate footprint? That's one way of helping polar bears. Sometimes these activities can be relatively small and technical. Other times they sort of feed into how we live our life on this planet and some of the things we can do as individuals to minimize our sort of effect on the environment, to minimize our effect on some of these species at risk and the habitats that they use.
Very interesting. So next up, someone read my mind when they asked this because I was wondering this as well. How do you put a tracker on a caribou or other large animal? How do you locate them to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not easy. It's difficult. It depends on the species. Now, with caribou, with a GPS collar like this, there's a couple of ways of doing it, but the most common way is to find these animals in the winter when they're away from the trees or maybe out in the open on a lake. And then you have a helicopter and you have someone that flies alongside the caribou and they fire this thing that looks like a net, but it comes out of a rifle with, let's see, 4 barrels on it, I guess, sort of like that. And it sort of comes out, spreads out, lands on the caribou. The caribou can't walk anymore. People land, sort of gently sort of wrestle the caribou down, blindfold it, and then put this collar on, and then you sort of stand up and let the caribou run away. So that's how we do that with caribou. Now with something like this, with tailed frogs, it's a lot less technical. You basically go to the aquarium store, you get one of those little fish dip nets, and you walk around in the forest until you see them, and then you put it on them. And then you got to be really careful though that you handle the animal respectfully, you don't harm the animal, and you quickly sort of stretch its legs out and open up this, put this little tracker on, and then you again release the animal once you know that it's doing well. So it depends on the species you're dealing with. With really, really large animals, sometimes they'll use drugs to actually immobilize them. With bears or wolves, you don't really want to be sort of walking around and handling them. So they'll use a drug that sort of puts the animal to sleep, and then the animal sort of wakes up and now has a fancy new necklace and hopefully goes on and does its business for the rest of its life.
Awesome, thank you. Next up here, we have a question from Katie. So Katie would like to know, how do you decide if a species is endangered? Who decides that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katie. It depends on where you are in the world. There are a number of different agencies that will assess how at risk a species is. In Canada, there's this organization called the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. So it's a mouthful. The acronym is COSEWIC, COSEWIC. They have a webpage. You can go there and see all of the great work they do. I'm a member of COSEWIC, so I'm involved in that. And really what we do is we have a species that is proposed to us. Someone's worried about that species. They think that it's either rare or it's declining. And then we work with the data that are available. So it may be GPS collar data to know how big the range is of that species and is it shrinking over time. Or have we done population surveys where we're tracking the population over time and we've noticed that it's gone from 1,000 animals to 500 to 100 to 50. If we see a population that's declining like that, then that will tell us how at risk it is. And that species may be determined to be endangered, which means a lot of risk, threatened, which means it's at risk, it's not quite endangered yet, and then special concern, which means it has something about its ecology or something about the threats that suggest if we don't manage it appropriately, that species could become endangered. The BC government has a different system. Different provinces and territories have a different system. There's actually a really, really big international program called the Red List. Red listed species, that's not good. That means they're endangered. They look at all the species around the world. So again, you can get on your computer, you can Google Red List, and you can get a report on almost every species in the world, including the ones that we don't have here in Canada, like the giant panda, or the kiwi, or that really cute fairy penguin.
Great, and as a second part to that, Katie would also like to know, are there any animals that we have prevented from going extinct?
Oh yes, so lots of animals that we prevented from going extinct, which is always really nice. You really want to hear about those animals that at one time were almost disappeared from Canada or globally, and they've come back. One that comes to mind is the peregrine falcon, which was threatened by chemicals in its environment, contaminants that had really made it difficult for that species to reproduce. And the peregrine falcon is actually doing quite well now across Canada. In other places, something called the California condor, found in California and Mexico, there were very, very few left. And they actually brought all the condors into a captive breeding facility in California at some zoos. They raised the eggs, they hatched the eggs, and they released them to the wild. And now we have many more California condors. So there are a lot of good news stories. It's not all bad news. The work we do as conservation scientists can be quite effective.
Very cool. Next up here, so we were talking about invasive species last week, so I think someone remembers a little bit about that. Lindsay wants to know, is there a species in Canada that people would be surprised to learn is invasive?
Is there a species in Canada that people would be surprised to know that they are invasive? Well, that really depends. It really depends on how well you know your local environment. Some invasive species are from outside of Canada, and so they get lots of exposure. Some invasive species are from inside Canada, and they've just simply been moved around. One invasive species that I'm familiar with as a kid is something called smallmouth bass. It's common in eastern Canada, but it's not supposed to be here in western Canada. But as a kid, I would go out and catch them. They're a lot of fun to catch. They're about this big, and I had no idea that that species was not supposed to be in those lakes in southern Vancouver Island, and that it was having some effects on the other fish and aquatic vertebrates in those lakes. So yeah, it really depends on how much you know about your local environment and again, the sort of level of invasiveness as well.
Very good, thank you. Next up, we have a question submitted on social media again. So, is captive breeding safe?
That's a great question again. Is captive breeding safe? Captive breeding has had lots of successes in recovering species at risk. Many of us feel that captive breeding is the last ditch effort. It's the thing we do when we're absolutely desperate to keep a species from going extinct or from being extirpated in Canada. We've had much success. We've also had some failures with captive breeding. I'll talk a little bit about some of the success stories. There's a species called the swift fox, found across the prairies. Just like the name suggests, it's fast, it's small, okay, a little bit bigger than a cat, and that was almost lost from the prairies, and the captive breeding program brought that back. There's another species from the prairies called the black-footed ferret. That was lost from the prairies. We have a captive breeding program. It was almost lost from the world. We thought it was actually extinct, and then a farmer's dog found a small group of them. They were able to bring them into captivity, raise them, release them, and we now have black-footed ferrets in the United States. We tried that in Canada, and they've since been lost, okay? So that's on sort of the back burner to try again. I talked a bit about the Vancouver Island marmot, another species that's benefited from captive breeding. There's a captive breeding program based in Mount Washington, but also a couple of other zoos And that captive breeding program, many people feel, is what has been the sort of primary reason why, or one of the main reasons why we still have Vancouver Island marmots in the wild in British Columbia.
Awesome, thank you. We'll finish off with our last question here. So what made you decide to study caribou as sort of your main focus?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, when I was an undergraduate student at university, I was really interested in conservation and natural resource management. Like a lot of people, I was sort of attracted to this wonderful sort of range of wildlife and sort of really exotic species that we have here in Canada. And an opportunity came up to go to graduate school to do my Master's of Science or my PhD on the ecology of caribou. And that's exactly what I did. So I did my PhD on caribou in an area about 100 kilometers sort of northeast of Prince George. And it's just stuck. I just have a lot of respect for the species. And it's also a species that needs a lot of help. So I like to talk about caribou. I like to do whatever science I can to help conserve caribou. And of course, I hope that there will be a brighter future for caribou as a result of that work.
Very cool, thank you. Well, that's all the questions we have for you today, so thank you so much for answering those and joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, everybody, that's all we have for you today. Thanks for tuning in to our second last Ask a Prof Friday this summer. We have one more coming next week, and you won't want to miss it, so tune in. We'd like to say a huge thank you to Dr. Johnson for joining us today. I hope you guys all learned as much about these species as I did. That was really cool. And thank you to you guys for tuning in. We'll see you all next week. Bye.